Today, Sunday, the 13th of February, 2022, I set out initially to record a few words on the new regulations, COVID regulations that might kick in on the 24th of February or thereabouts. But I think that it would be churlish to discuss only COVID at a time when we're admonished that a war might break out in Europe, in the Ukraine, not so far from us in the West, in 48 hours. In other words, next Tuesday, to be precise. Now, if one looks at what's happening, the satellite images that I've seen, that we've all seen also on the telly, or the analysts and observers who have been writing and speaking about the crisis, there are roughly now 130,000 troops, Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, and there is also a Belarusian involvement with the military maneuvers happening between the two countries. So this buildup inevitably gives an ominous feeling, produces an ominous feeling of, will President Vladimir Putin start a war? Will he attack the Ukraine? Or, as he and the Russian Federation claims, this is all Western hysteria? Well, as every other analyst and observer and pundit and even politicians have said, nobody knows the answer to that question, because nobody knows what's going on in President Putin's head. He is po-faced, and he's kept everybody guessing as to whether and when he might attack the Ukraine. Now, at our end, we have also been busy. The Prime Minister was in Kiev, but equally importantly, the Foreign Secretary was in Moscow. So was the Defense Secretary, who had a more successful journey to Russia and who has been quite clear in telling us, in instructing us, in highlighting the issues that we're dealing with in this crisis. Although, mind you, his reference when he said that there is a whiff of Munich in the air, I don't necessarily agree with that sort of language. Perhaps he was saying it to alert us that we mustn't ignore the crisis. Perhaps he was having a dig at the French and at Emmanuel Macron for his negotiations with Russia to try and find a diplomatic solution, although diplomacy is certainly not something to be laughed at. But when he said there is a whiff of Munich in the air, of course, it was an apparent reference to the agreement that allowed the German annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938, which incidentally failed to prevent the Second World War. So, a dig or not a dig, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't a diplomatic way of expressing oneself. Perhaps he didn't want to be diplomatic in order to reflect the dangers lurking ahead of us. But Germany has also been seeking a diplomatic solution. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is going to the Ukraine, has been meeting with all sorts of people, both within the EU and Russia, in order to try and see if there is something that could be done. Why? Because Germany, on the one hand, has a big economic stake on any crisis, any war in the Ukraine, on the Ukrainian-Russian border, because of this famous, infamous, I don't know, Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Will that pipeline see the light of day? Would it become functional? Would a war then basically mothball the whole expensive and economically viable project for the export of Russian gas into Europe. That is something that German politicians, from the former Chancellor Angela Merkel to the present politicians, are very keenly aware of. And by the way, just since we are on the subject of Germany, let me also add that one of the biggest lobbyists and friends of Vladimir Putin, who happens to be a lawyer too, is Gerhard Schroeder. Gerhard Schroeder, who himself was a chancellor in Germany, who hails, like the present Chancellor Olaf Scholz, from the SPD party, and who is on the board of directors of Gazprom. Gazprom being the state-owned energy company that is behind the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So in these few compressed words, I think I was trying to show you the urgency, that this is no laughing matter, and I don't think many people still consider this a laughing matter, and I don't think many people are totally oblivious to what is happening on the Ukrainian borders. But, and I repeat the but, as somebody who is steeped into conflict resolution and alternative dispute resolution principles, this doesn't mean that we have to go into war. If diplomacy, even if diplomacy is brittle, if diplomacy can salvage the situation and can avoid a war, because at the end of the day, war is never such a good thing. War is unpredictable. Once it starts, you don't know how it will stop. And in a sense, war will be affecting, first and foremost, the Ukrainian population, the people who are in the Ukraine, whether far away in the capital Kiev, or in the west in Lviv and elsewhere, or on the borders themselves. So a lot of caution, a lot of care, a lot of prudence, but also an awareness. And why do I say an awareness? Because I think one factor that is important for me is that there are two completely different asymmetrical principles involved here. If we look at the Western approach, let's call it the Helsinki principle, it's that we're in a post-Cold War era. The world is open for people to decide on their alliances, their friends, and what they do. This has been a case with Ukraine, but it has also been a case with Armenia and other countries who used to belong to the former Soviet Socialist alliance. Versus that, you have the Yalta principle, which basically says, no, the Cold War principle of I know my enemies, my foes, and I know my friends, and the world is divided between friends and foes, and there is some sort of a balance that nobody would tilt too much one way or another. I personally think that we're beyond this. And actually, one thing I would also throw for your consideration, maybe you could mull over it, I don't know, is that the West has actually tried to use diplomacy. The West hasn't even used proper economic sanctions, since we're talking about sanctions and huge sanctions. Listen, in 2008, what happened in Georgia? In 2014, what happened in the Ukraine? If the West, and by the West I mean North America as much as Western Europe, and now many of the countries in Eastern Europe as well. If the West is really serious about its principles, its standpoints, its defense of the freedom of choice, of the Helsinki principle, of the reality that you cannot just go and run into a country and take the country over because you don't like its impact on you. If that is true, then Georgia 2008 Ukraine 2014 belie or undermine that principle. And perhaps this is why President Biden is being so forceful about this crisis, other than the fact, of course, that he's trying to overcome the huge fiasco of the Afghan withdrawal. So, in all of this, in this mishmash of different considerations that I'm trying to throw into this episode in some few sparse moments, so they might not be very, very clear. I hope some of you will get some of my thoughts about it. My primary concern are the people of the Ukraine who will bear the brunt of any flare-up, of any confrontation, of any war. But at the same time, there are principles that we must stand up for if we really are candid and honest about those principles that we are defending. Now, enough of Ukraine. It's not my area, it's not my neighborhood, it's not my expertise. I'm just talking to you as an ordinary person, sharing some thoughts with you, because as I said, it would be churlish to jump into COVID when everybody seems to talk about the Ukraine. So back to COVID matters. And what I wanted to basically highlight today is the fact that the Prime Minister has said that toward the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken, the 24th of February, most of the COVID rules and restrictions will be lifted. Now, I'm going just to leave a few points, moot points, for you to consider. What would happen if we remove all those restrictions? Aren't we enhancing, facilitating the possibility of a future new strain or variant that might kill more? Question. Another question for me, which I find bizarre, is that Her Majesty's government advisors, the medical and scientific advisors, in other words, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, they used to be on our screens every day with the PM, with other people, showing us graphic representations of what's happening with COVID, etc., etc. Suddenly, I don't hear anything from them. So what do they think about the total lifting of the restrictions? Can they basically have another one of those press conferences and show us the evidence? Because frankly, given Partygate and given the shenanigans of most of the ministers of this government, the factor of trust, at least for me, is quite fragile. So I want to convince myself that in lifting these restrictions, in taking these measures, are we doing them on health ground or are we doing them on political grounds just in order to please our constituency and our school of MPs who think in that direction and therefore make sure that they'll go easy on me and I'll stay Prime Minister? Just mooting another question. Please don't shoot the messenger. I'm just saying, where are the two scientific and medical officers? Have the decisions been taken on political grounds or on health-based grounds? And what about if a new strain comes suddenly and we find ourselves in the same mess? Now, I'm going to quote here people who know far more about COVID, about epidemiology, about pandemics than I ever could learn. I'm going to quote them and I'm going to give you 3 or 4 names and just leave it up to you to decide what you think. Now, the dangers, first one, the dangers posed by accepting the widespread assumption that COVID-19 variants would continue to get milder in their impact. In other words, that this is not true, that they're going to get milder and milder until they disappear. The famous phrase of the pandemic becoming an endemic and we've got to live with it and herd immunity and what have you. But this idea, this assumption that the the variants would continue to get milder. In other words, the one after Omicron, and there is already one that people are talking about, and the ones after that will be milder, and therefore they will be even less of an impact than flu. According to the epidemiologist, Professor Mark Woodhouse of Edinburgh University, that is patently not true. And I quote him, and I've got here a sheet, so I'm going to give you a literal quote, not a paraphrase. He said, the Omicron variant did not come from the Delta variant. It came from a completely different part of the virus's family tree. And since we don't know where in the virus's family tree a new variant is going to come from, we cannot know how pathogenic it might be. It could be less pathogenic, in other words, less harmful, but it could just as easily be more pathogenic. Now, his point was backed by the virologist, Professor Lawrence Young of Warwick University, who said, and again, I quote, not paraphrase, people seem to think there has been a linear evolution of the virus from alpha to beta to delta to Omicron. I think he said this to the Observer, but that is simply not the case. The idea that virus variants will continue to get milder is wrong. A new one could, not would, could turn out to be even more pathogenic than the Delta variant, for example. And David Nabarro, who's a special envoy on COVID-19 for the World Health Organization, for WHO, also highlighted the uncertainty of how future variants might behave. And he said, there will be more variants after Omicron. And if they are more transmissible, they will dominate. In addition, they may cause different patterns of illness. In other words, they may turn out to be more lethal or have more long-term consequences. In so doing, Nabarro urged authorities to continue to plan for the possibility that there will be surges in numbers of people who are ill and need hospital care. He said it would be prudent to encourage people to protect themselves and others consistently. An approach that does not do this would be a gamble with potentially severe consequences. I cannot see any upsides to such a gamble, he added. The pandemic has a long way to go. And as is the case since it started, people and their leaders will influence its long-term impact through actions they take now. And finally, Jillian Evans, head of health intelligence at NHS Grampian, urged for a slow and cautious move out of the existing restrictions. In fact, what she said highlights the fact that the lifting of those restrictions will apply to England. And as you well know, the UK consists of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So, my question still stands, notwithstanding those quotations that I shared with you. Were we too hasty? Are we being too hasty? Are we doing this backed by medical and scientific evidence or data? Or are we doing it for political reasons? Or perhaps for a combination, a blend of health and politics? This is what I want to know in order for me, and I assume a lot of you, not all of you I know, I could guess, but some of you might wish to know the answer that those two advisors to HMG would give us in order for us to decide whether this is a step too far or not a step too far. You know, I'm not a killjoy. Don't think it's fun for me, just as it's not fun for millions of people in our country and across the world, let alone in Europe to have to deal with these. Are we keeping the face masks? Are we taking off the face masks? Are we doing this? Are we doing that? I agree with all that. But I just call you, as I did for the Ukraine crisis and called for prudence, I also call you now to be cautious and to be informed of the decisions we are taking. Then, as in the Ukraine, but more importantly in our case for the pandemic, you can make your minds up. Take care and have a nice Sunday.